I will just share my screen with my slides, and hopefully that should be visible now. And yes, as you can see, I've changed my title a little bit. So now the title reads Message in a Teacup, Normalisation, Jindřich, Polák, and the Crazy Comedy. And as you can probably guess from the still and from the title, I'm going to focus on one specific film here, but talk more generally about Polák's career as well. On Saturday, the 16th of January, 1982, at 9:35 p.m., Britain's BBC Two screened for the first and apparently only time Jindřich Polák's 1977 Czechoslovak sci-fi comedy Tomorrow I'll Wake Up and Scold Myself with Tea, Zítra vstanu a pářím se čajem. Screened in the channel's long-running Film International slot, the film seems to have been watched by a surprising number of people, netting those unsuspecting viewers who were waiting for the weekly football show to start on BBC One. For those who caught the screening, Polák's film became the stuff of legend, surviving mainly as a memory in the early days of home video recording and nearly impossible to identify and track down in the years before the internet. With its long, bizarre title and even more outrageous storyline revolving around identical twins, the relentless manipulation of time, and a nefarious plot to go back to World War II and give a nuclear bomb to Hitler, Polák's farcical fantasy must have felt like a visitation from some unknown, bizarre, or alien world. In a sense, this is exactly what the film was. It hailed from the bizarre world of normalization, itself a topsy-turvy way of describing the processes by which communist Czechoslovakia in the 1970s reimposed an authoritarian political culture in the wake of the bold experiment with reform in the 1960s. The talk that follows aims to situate this film both within and outside of the circumstances of normalization. It will look at how this film at once reflects, escapes, and possibly defies the political cultural context in which it arose, and it will make a case for the film's enduring appeal and value. So the world of normalization was brought into being by the events of the 20th of August 1968, when Czechoslovakia was invaded by the Warsaw Pact armies on the orders of a Soviet leadership anxious about the liberalizing reforms of the Prague Spring. But normalization only really started in earnest after the reformist Communist Party First Secretary Alexander Dubček was ousted and replaced by a new leader, Gustav Husák, in April 1969. Husák's regime embarked on a systematic eradication of the Prague Spring's legacies, implementing a pervasive process of political screening that sought to purge anyone tainted by 60s reformism from the party and public life.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Czechoslovak cinema was certainly not spared the sweep of normalization. Throughout late 1969 and early 1970, much of the film industry's key personnel was deposed in favor of more politically reliable, if often less professionally competent replacements, and the industry was reorganized, with the increasingly self-contained and autonomous creative group system of the late 1960s abolished for a more tightly controlled system in which film development was separated from film production. A new era of cinema now began, as manifested in the official determination to destroy the internationally renowned Czechoslovak New Wave. So the work of Jindřich Polák was a notable and in some ways exemplary feature of normalization cinema. Polák had begun directing in the mid-1950s, establishing early on the genre-based, entertainment-oriented approach that he would thrive in through the 1970s and 80s. His debut feature, Death in the Saddle, is a Czech twist on American Westerns, and throughout the 1960s, he made crime films, science fiction, children's fantasy, an ill-fated comedy musical, and a war film. Polák was never really part of the new wave, though his work did expand the boundaries of genre in adventurous ways. Icarus XB1, which probably remains Polák's best-known and most highly regarded film internationally, is a work of art sci-fi with its modernist production design and sober philosophical tone, while Riders in the Sky uses a war action film framework to address the hitherto politically taboo topic of the Czech and Slovak fighter pilots who joined Britain's RAF during World War II. But perhaps the most significant film that Polák made in the 1960s with regard to his later career was not a prestigious work like Icarus XB1, but a sci-fi film that he made for children, the 1962 Clown Ferdinand and the Rocket. It was this film that caught the attention of West German television producer Gert K. Müntefering. And in 1968, while Polák was editing Riders in the Sky, Müntefering approached him with the proposal to make a children's series in co-production with the West German broadcaster WDR, Westdeutscher Rundfunk. This moment, in which Polák initiates a successful Western co-production, just as he is completing his last taboo-tackling film of the 1960s, represents something of a symbolic turning point between the cinemas of the Prague Spring and Normalisation eras. And it contrasts the future that Polák could have faced with the one that he actually did face. Riders in the Sky's unwelcome subject matter could easily have seen Polák censured, limited, made to do artistic penance as Normalisation dawned. In reality, his lucrative television contract with West Germany secured him official favour and saved him, as Polák himself claimed, from the film industry's purges. Working together with producer Müntefering and writer Otto Hoffmann, Polák enjoyed great success with one Czechoslovak West German TV series after another. The first of these was Pan Tau, or Mr. Tau, whose magical, size-changing, bowler-hatted protagonist leads young children on mischievous but always good-natured adventures. Pan Tau was as beloved by children off-screen as on-screen, and he appeared in two further series, the last of which was also repackaged into two feature films. Another popular series was the 1983 The Visitors, a lavish and richly conceived time travel story taking place in both 1984 and 2484, which achieved a lasting cult reputation in both West and East Germany. Polak's series was shown all around the world, including in Canada, Australia, and Japan. And by the time he made The Visitors, he was attracting additional co-production financing from France and Switzerland. If Polak's feature work took a back seat to his TV series in the 70s and 80s, he attained continued success on the big screen too, for instance with his grim 1979 thriller, Death of Hitchhikers. So the official trust that was bestowed on Polák is a matter of record. As Normalisation began, he retained his place in the Czechoslovak Communist Party as other filmmakers were being expelled from it, and he is listed in party documents among those directors who had been successfully won over for our politics. Polak's position was an unusually privileged one. At a time when Czechoslovakia had again sealed its borders with Western Europe, he was permitted to take extensive working trips abroad, filming episodes of various series in West Germany, Belgium, Holland, and Portugal. Furthermore, he was never pressured into making an overtly political regime-promoting film, in contrast to other filmmakers such as the also officially favoured and popular Václav Volíček. By all accounts, Polak's privileged status derived not from anything underhand, such as having turned informer, but simply from the enormous revenues that his films and series generated. Polak's cinematic landscape, or Poland as it came to be nicknamed in the film industry, was clearly something of an idyll or a sanctuary within the world of Normalisation Czechoslovakia, whether for the film crew members who could travel abroad to work on them, or for the audiences who were imaginatively transported by them. Yet if Polak's work, along with that of Volíček, Oldřich Lipský, Karel Kakině, and a few other directors, represents one of the brightest spots in Normalisation cinema, it also typifies important tendencies within it. To a large extent, Normalisation cinema was a cinema of entertainment. It is true that this period saw a renewed commitment to the making of openly political, ideologically tendentious films, and that the principles of socialist realism were revived, albeit in a looser, more flexible way than in the Stalinist early 50s. Films of this kind continued to be made, accounting, as Stepan Hulik shows, for a third of national production in the year 1973 and remaining at around a quarter in the years that followed. These were not, with certain exceptions, these were not really, though, the films that audiences wanted to see. Hulik argues that such political filmmaking served ultimately as self-affirmation for the regime, rather than as any meaningful way of consolidating its power. This latter function was assumed by what Brigitte Petachkova calls the apparently ideologically neutral realm of mass entertainment. Petachkova sees the cinema as an integral part of the consumer culture through which the Husak regime sought to win the acquiescence of the Czechoslovak public, while Hulik sees such films as serving an anesthetizing or indeed amnesiating function, enabling citizens to forget about the political ferments of the 1960s. There were further, perhaps no less pressing, economic motivations for making entertainment films, especially amid the international trade troubles of the 1970s. It was the light, popular genres of children's films and the so-called crazy comedy that had the prospect of attracting Western interest and earning much-needed foreign revenue. The children's film and the crazy comedy are two genres in which Polák specialized. And Tomorrow I'll Wake Up and Scold Myself with Tea, the film on which this talk is focused, is a choice example of the latter genre, co-scripted as it was by one of the genre's great masters, writer Miloš Mazurek. Also known as the fantastic or hybrid comedy, the crazy comedy emerged in Czechoslovakia in the early 1960s, and yet it has been considered much more representative or emblematic of the normalization era. As Petra Hanáková has noted, it has long been judged by Czech critics as the epitome of ideologically complicit mass entertainment and a perverse oozing of perverse times. For good or bad, perverse is not an inapt description of the crazy comedy. Tomorrow I'll Wake Up and Scold Myself with Tea might well have struck its British viewers in 1982 as a singularly bizarre melange of science fiction, thriller, farce, black comedy, and real history. But in many ways, this is a typical example of what was by this point an established comic formula, right down to the eccentrically long title. That hybridization of genres characteristic of the crazy comedy has itself been read as reflective of contemporaneous cultural politics, with the merging of, say, comedy and science fiction acting to appease those hardline cultural officials uneasy about the adoption of Hollywood-style genre material in its pure form, while also fulfilling the acknowledged need to provide audience with genre diversity. So in what follows, I want to use the example of Tomorrow I Will Wake Up and Scold Myself with Tea to explore that charge of the crazy comedy's ideological complicity, suggesting that the film does indeed espouse the politics of its time, even as its particularly perverse hybridization of elements works against its political persuasiveness. The political dimensions of entertainment cinema under normalization, in fact, runs deeper than its pacifying, anesthetizing function. Theoretically, Czechoslovakia's cultural officials may have accepted that there was a place for so-called čistý humor, or pure humor, humor that was not intended to serve an ideological or educative purpose, and the crazy comedy may have come closest to the principle of pure humor. But in practice, however, even such light entertainment films were often far from devoid of political content or ideological lessons. As Tomáš Grunterad has noted, under normalization, genre films frequently went into production accompanied by the assurance that their stylized fictional worlds were really connected to reality and infused with a message of some kind. Tomorrow I'll Wake Up and Scold Myself with Tea was no exception. In the 1977 to 1981 dramaturgical plan for Barrandov Studios, the film is described as using the audience-pleasing form of the science fiction comedy to point out the prevalent and even increasing danger of fascism in today's world, a message in line, of course, with normalization politics, as well as more broadly with the rhetoric of the Brezhnev era. This message was reinforced in various articles on the film from before its release, and in interviews with both Polák and even with the film's lead actor, Petr Kostka. According to the journal Filma Doba, the film's central theme was the societally grave and still current problem of fascism. In Lidová demokracia, the film is described as a warning about any kind of fascism, and Polák himself is quoted in reference to the fascism that exists today in a form no less dangerous than its Nazi incarnation. Interviewed in a feature on the film's production for the journal Kino, Polák claims that what excited him about this time-scrambling story was the chance that it offered him to show Hitler being confronted with the consequences of his politics. Now, Grunterad questions how far such political messages were actually present in these genre films, and how far such framing was simply a means to help these films get approved for production. In addition, as Lukáš Skupa notes, film projects were then officially ranked into 4 categories of prestige, and a canny use of the right political terminology could help raise a film's category and thus ensure greater remuneration for cast and crew. In the case of Tomorrow I'll Wake Up and Scald Myself with Tea, however, the political message is a matter of both expedient framing and actual textual content. A short synopsis of this most wayward of plots will help ground the commentary that follows. So the film is set in the then future of Prague in 1996, a future in which, thanks to space technology, time travel has become a reality, and a company even offers tourist excursions into the past. A group of former Nazi officers conspire to hijack one of the time-traveling spaceships and return to 1945 so that they can give Hitler a hydrogen bomb and enable him to win World War II. Abetting their scheme is the time machine's pilot, Karel Bureš, who lives with his upstanding identical twin brother, Jan. When Karel chokes to death on a breakfast roll, Jan well-meaningly pretends to be his brother, unwilling to reveal the death to his brother's fiancée, and he is drawn unwittingly into the Nazis' plot. By a mishap, the time machine ends up not in 1945, but in 1941, just as Hitler is savouring his greatest triumphs, and the plot backfires, with the Führer denouncing the time travellers. From this point on, the plot becomes a breathless and increasingly confusing series of leaps back and forth in time, of repetitions, deaths, and duplicated identities. Needless to say, this futuristic farce is very far from being a committed exposé of resurgent fascism. For a start, the still active fascist forces here are chiefly incarnated as stereotypical former Nazis living in South America, cliched figures redolent of another much better known Nazi-themed sci-fi thriller from the time, the Hollywood film The Boys from Brazil. Yet it is not inaccurate to describe this film as politically on message, developing as it does a subtle but sustained opposition between westernized fascist and good socialist anti-fascist. Key to this opposition are the identical twins of Karel and Jan Bureš, the film's antagonist and protagonist respectively. The womanizing spaceship pilot Karel is at once a dashing, Bond-like, and thus implicitly westernized figure and a Nazi collaborator. By contrast, the more retiring Jan, a rocket designer, proves to be the model socialist citizen who restores all moral order by eventually replacing his dead fascist brother with a duplicated version of himself and getting the Nazi plotters arrested and jailed, the informer as socially responsible ideal. Tendentious Cold War oppositions are reinforced by further subtle details. Early on, a radio is heard announcing that the socialist states have ensured the success of the peace conference, while immediately after we are informed that a bomb has been stolen from a military museum in Washington. Thus, the socialist countries represent peace and the progressive future, the latter signified by a Prague that is now the center of technological marvels like time travel, while the capitalist states like the US represent war and the reactionary past, the latter signified by reference to the military museum. The normalization-friendly warning here is that latent fascism lurks in the capitalist West. And yet such aspects of the film are markedly at odds with what we know of viewer responses to the film, which generally appear either unaware of or uninterested in these political dimensions. The many contemporary reviews posted on the Československá filmová databáze, for instance, typically praise the film for its humor, its effects, and its breathless narrative intricacies, and treats its political dimensions as marginal, insofar as these are even mentioned. More striking still are the extant British responses to the film, in large part rooted in that solitary BBC Two screening mentioned at the beginning of this talk. Online British reviews praise the film with such descriptions as a brilliant tongue-in-cheek comedy, a minor work of genius, an energizingly clever comedy, and a bonkers wacky farce. The film has thus proven easily detachable from its political underpinnings, more easily, no doubt, in a British context where viewers may understandably have been less versed in catching the subtle pro-communist commentary than in a Czechoslovak one. One reviewer on the Internet Movie Database, who admittedly did not have the benefit of English subtitles, He even ascribes a subversive message to the film, expanding on its time and history manipulating premise to consider a scenario in which time travel stopped the Soviets marching into Prague in the 1940s or indeed in 1968. I wish here, however, to propose another response to the film. If the film's bonkers mix of genres and its wild black humor allow the viewer to overlook its endorsement of normalization politics, its same crazy comedy formula of generic hybridity and bad taste can also be seen as sabotaging its political function. Central to the film's perverse effect, of course, is the very presence of the fascism that was also used to assert the film's seriousness of purpose. The mixing together of farcical comedy with the theme of Nazism takes its most heightened and outrageous form when we go back to the Second World War and see in his military bunker Hitler in person, surrounded by his staff. Much of this scene is riotously comic, as when the two American tourists whose time travel trip has been hijacked show up in the bunkers, and when a black briefcase is opened, not to reveal, as expected, the hydrogen bomb, but the tourists' linen underwear. Towards the end of the scene, though, the chief Nazi plotter takes out a small film projection device in order to show Hitler how the war will end if he does not use the bomb. As the documentary evidence of the Germans' defeat unfolds, Hitler angrily demands the projected film be stopped, but he then watches it again by himself, horrified but helplessly transfixed by the real images of military devastation, culminating in the capture of Berlin and the Nuremberg trials. So here, Polák delivers on his stated concern to confront Hitler with the results of his actions, and the film attains actual dramatic power, even chillingly so. The gravity of tone here jars against the farcical business elsewhere, just as the piercing actuality of the war footage sits oddly alongside the whimsical sci-fi trappings and comic stylization. Eva Hepnerová, reviewing the film upon release for the Czech journal Záběr, felt that the film acquired a tragic dimension here and exceeded the boundaries of genre. Another reviewer of the time, Jaromír Blažejovský in Rovnost, made the more sweeping comment that Hitler, the Second World War, and real shots of Soviet soldiers storming the Reichstag had no place along crazy sci-fi or the traditional gags of the Czech comedy arsenal. It could be argued then that the jarring nature of these juxtapositions helps expose, foreground, and denaturalize the importation of didactic political elements into works of entertainment. In other words, the normalization era's renewed practice of putting films into political service is transformed into another manifestation of the crazy comedy's gleefully discordant Frankenstein-like hybridization of genres. Additionally, the use of documentary footage here at once literalizes and subverts the requirement of infusing reality into this fiction, with the gulf between fiction and reality made especially evident when we see the film's fictional Hitler looking at documentary imagery of the real Hitler. So, to sum up, this paper has tried to reveal Tomorrow I'll Wake Up and Scold Myself with Tea as a fascinating, contradictory text that at once incorporates, transcends, and resists the cultural politics of the normalization era. In the first respect, it can be read merely as symptomatic of its context, using its narrative to construct a tendentious political message. But in the next respect, like many of the other crazy comedies, the film can be appreciated as an imaginative and well-crafted piece of entertainment, a wonderfully eccentric cult object fully befitting of the enthusiasm that it aroused in the UK. Finally, the film can be seen as a kind of meta-commentary, unintentionally no doubt, on the interferences and expediencies of normalization-era film culture, whose competing priorities of audience-pulling commercialism and political conformity could lead to an at times odd synthesis of ideology and entertainment, a spoonful of medicine with the sugar, if you will, or a message in a teacup. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Actually, well, thank you for the presentation, and the film is quite baffling indeed, and it's at the same time it's quite. I think it's like the pinnacle of the 70s cinema in so many ways, and yes, and well, the last time I don't remember if you were here, but we were talking about a bunch of films that kind of transcended and represented the very essence of the 70s genre conventions and non-conventions in the Soviet cinema of the period. And actually we see it in this film like in no other film, I believe, of the Czechoslovak 70s. I've got some questions, and unless anybody has any immediate questions, like urgently need to know, then you can take some time and to prepare your own questions online or in the audience. And I will benefit from my privileged position and start. So actually, this is very interesting. Well, I've got a bunch of institutional networking questions along with more aesthetic, thematic questions. So I will start with the former. It is interesting you're mentioning the role, well, the participation of Miloš Macourek, who is normally works, because we know of those duos of authors, which are especially of filmmakers, since screenwriter, director duos like Miloš Macourek and Václav Varliček, who worked together from the 60s onwards, almost exclusively, I'd say, in the genre cinema at least. And it is interesting to see that this shift occurs for this film. And would there be any way to evaluate and to measure the role and the level of implication of Macourek in this project? Because, for example, in another film that he makes with Varliček, like You're a Widow, Sir, we see little bits of the same, like political plotting, conspiracy, military conspiracy against a king, I believe. So we kind of see this theme already, but I was wondering about the networking and the industrial dimension of it. And not to be very long, but a brief question on the same networking thing. Do you know if, well, it is interesting to know that throughout the 70s, Polák could continue working quite freely, and he did not make those Ulitba films and stuff. Indeed. And do you know if he kind of helped the less fortunate colleagues like Oldřich Lipsky did for Jerzy Brdečka at the same period, for example? Did he have a role as did he use this power to work with colleagues who were maybe less fortunate?
That's a great question. I'll answer the second, the latter question first, I think, because yes, in Helena Sruba's book about specifically about the television series that Polák and Varliček worked on with West Germany, she does mention that I think Polák was very conscious of the, I think quite exceptionally or very privileged role that he had, and I think he was conscious that that could create resentment, and I think he did indeed try as much as he could to shelter and to help, yes, as you say, the less fortunate. I'm not quite sure with regard to screenwriters how far that was true with any of the writing partners that he worked with. I mean, I think that Macourek and also Otto Hoffmann, who was his main writing collaborator, I think they already had a fairly assured status themselves, but certainly he was that way inclined. I believe he did like as far as he could to help people. In fact, one of the things that Sruba talked about in her book is the fact that whenever Polák would go to West Germany, for example, or to Belgium, he would usually have a long list of requirements or of things that people wanted to buy, and so he would just buy things for people. And he was very, yes, I think as far as he could, he did try to assist and help others. But yeah, that's an interesting question as regards whether he protected any specific writers. I mean, I think that Macourek himself was fairly well situated. As regards Macourek's role in this project, yeah, I mean, it's really interesting you bring up the connection with You Are a Widow, Sir. And I was also thinking of the fact that I believe Macourek also co-wrote the Zbigniew Brynik film I Justice, Ja Spravedlnost, which of course is also a film. It's also a kind of counterfactual film involving Hitler, who again is personified or incarnated on screen. And
Excuse me, what film?
Ja Spravedlnost, which is not really a comedy. It's more of a kind of strange sci-fi political drama. I believe Mazurek I think it's based on a novel, but I believe Mazurek was involved in the script of that. I'll have to confirm that, but I believe he was involved in that. Rather an odd project for him because it's not a comedy. But that's a film that I always kind of relate in a way to this one, and I often get the Hitler actors mixed up because I think this film, it's František Vicena, which is strange in itself because he often played a more heroic role in other kinds of film, and I think it's Fritz Dietz in the Brynik film. But there is a certain parallel with that film. I mean, the film is nominally Tomorrow I'll Wake Up and Scold Myself with Tea, nominally is based on a short story by Josef Nesvadba, who was a very prominent sci-fi writer. The original story is called Vyprava opačným směrem, or like Voyage in the Opposite Direction. But in fact, the film bears almost no resemblance at all to the story. I mean, the only thing it really takes from that is the idea of time travel and the idea of trying to come back to the same point in the present and to rectify things, which is what happens in this film. But that's really the only connection and parallel with that. And so I believe that basically most of what we see on screen was Mazurek's invention. So, and I believe that I've even read that Nesvadba was, I think, quite unhappy at first with the way Mazurek, changed it and developed this crazy plot about the identical twins, and then they become kind of identical triples at one point, and there's this whole kind of bizarre process of duplication, and all of this, I believe, came from Mazurek. So I think very much what we're seeing is Mazurek's sensibility as much as Polak's. As you say, it's interesting that this is a rather strange collaboration in that, yes, usually Mazurek was collaborated with Vorlicek, and that was a fairly established partnership, whereas Polak's main partner was Hoffman. So I think perhaps some of the strangeness of this film may be attributed to the fact that this was, a rather one-off kind of pairing. So I'm thinking maybe a lot of the political, I wonder how much of the political dimension and the historical dimension came more from Polák, who of course had made, Riders in the Sky back in the 60s. And it does seem sincere that he really wanted to address this theme of, confronting Hitler with the consequences of his action. So I wonder if some of that hybridity is intensified by the fact that this was an unusual meeting of minds, I guess.
Thank you. Actually, it's good you mentioned Josef Nesvadba, because this is for people who know some of Czechoslovak cinema, and especially genre cinema, but maybe not very familiar with the whole universe. The one of the key figures, actually, I'd say, in this extended cinematic and literary universe is Josef Nesvadba, who was a psychiatrist and an author who would write a lot of science fiction, like very pulpy stuff that would not be out of place, I'd say, in magazines like The Amazing Stories in the English-speaking world of the early 20th century, like the first half of the 20th century. But then again, the paradox is that we find this literature and this writing on screen very late. Actually, it's very exceptionally, we find it in the 70s, in the 60s, in the early 80s, I believe. So yeah, if that's a name to look into for anybody who's interested in the atmosphere, the vibe, the aesthetics of Czechoslovak cinema with science fiction, maybe motifs.
He's not really a funny writer, I guess, in the way that these films are funny. I mean, there is a slightly absurd sensibility there, but it's not. Yes, it's not. Yes, it's maybe a little. I think, as I was when I first read his work, I was rather surprised and nonplussed because, yes, I think having seen this film, and also I think I Killed Einstein Gentleman, I think, is also based nominally on a Svadba story. Yeah, they really don't have that kind of crazy quality in quite the same way, I guess.
And they have I'd say they have a bit of subtlety to compare to what we kind of expect often of socialist cinema and socialist entertainment, literature and cinema. So it's not for children. It's not funny, as you're saying. So yeah, quite an interesting character and quite an important figure, I think, in himself. Yes. Another thing I would like to highlight from what you were saying is pass into the aesthetic part of the film itself. This use of documentary footage of newsreels, I suppose, from the era that are very clear from the opening credits on, because the opening credits are actually a speech, a filmed speech by Adolf Hitler given in reverse. So you kind of, and it creates, the concept I find useful in my own research applied to Czechoslovak cinema, like to no other cinema, I'd say, is Roland Barthes' Effet du réel, the effect of the real, because this is, and it puts you into this false real setting from the very first second of the film, but at the same time, everything goes awry and everything is announced as going to go even worse from the same at the same time. And the other thing that goes along with this use of documentary footage or other tools and other media from like real historical events in Czechoslovak cinema that pertains to the use of this effect of the real would be the immense attention to detail, because this film, it sounds crazy, but like I think every other film from Czechoslovakia that you would not expect to be very attentive to detail. You look at their apartments, you look at their workplace, you look at the airport location, and everything is just so well thought of. I'm very impressed each time, and I think this is what creates an even stranger effect, I think, in such movies as this one. Which
That's
makes me, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just what you said just reminded me that there is a strange website that records details about weapons that are featured in films, and I think there is actually a little entry on this film recording the specifications of the guns that are shown, and apparently everything, as you say, is completely accurate to the period when it's showing the Second World War period. And as you say, yes, that attention to detail for this kind of strange farcical plot, it is yes, it's very impressive.
Yeah, but it also, I believe it also shows the degree of importance that the cinema and the studio and the party would give to this kind of light entertainment film. They really wanted people to go to the movies, to watch those films, to like them, to just recognize something in them. So yes, what can come across as just light entertainment has much deeper and maybe sometimes insidious dimension. And the detail is where you see it. But also for me, the attention to detail, it speaks volumes on the role of art directors and of artists working on this project, because it's true for many artists who could not find work easily in the 70s. Precisely, they could go into cinema or into television and create those wonderful, just Baroque films, like almost the whole Uri Hertz's filmography, or a Vorlicek film, or a Polák film, maybe even Pantau, because Pantau is quite impressive visual as well. And yeah, and actually this kind of allows me to bridge to the other thing you've mentioned on the sabotage, the sabotage of the message by the film itself, by the cinematic language. And I think this is my impression that the role of art directors and of artists working on those sets, it kind of maybe perhaps goes in the same direction in the 70s, because you see it, for example, in my absolute go-to of the era, the 1973 Days of Betrayal by Otakar Vavra, which has the art direction, if I'm not mistaken, or at least the costumes and the general supervising by Esther Krumbachova, one of the biggest probably visual artists of the 20th century, kind of discovered posthumously and being discovered today, fortunately, female artists especially, and who was very important for the new wave in particular, and for the look of the new wave, and for this playfulness and this irreverence, and this just using references to other eras, other cultures, other art movements abroad, at home. And to be honest, in Days of Betrayal, when you see those scenes, again, with Hitler, strangely enough, you see those sequences and scenes where Hitler is like surrounded by flowers, wearing those silly shorts and like high socks and eating candy while being photographed for press. Or you see sequences of some, I don't know, 30 seconds of just a tapestry being filmed in what is supposed to be a propaganda film for Soviet Union, like an epic propaganda film, like maybe one of the most expensive films of the year. Yeah, you kind of have to wonder if there is no like tongue-in-cheek work from the crew, if not the director himself.
Yes, that's a very. I actually watched that film recently while preparing for this, and it is a very strange film, isn't it? I think.
It is.
Yes.
It is, and actually, my social media reminded me that almost exactly a year ago, I showed it at Ponrepo, and I was kind of afraid that people would take it as some kind of apology for the Communist Party, but it is its own thing. You cannot even like place it as propaganda piece. It is so baroque and so just odd and campy.
Very, very histrionic, isn't it? I remember the way that they present Gottwald, and it's just very fake looking somehow, just the whole vibe that you get from that. And I mean, I would say the Hitler figure is perhaps more realistically presented, ironically, in Polak's film, I think, than in that.
Yes. It's much more subdued for sure, yes. And actually, my last probably question for this sequence would consider the general style of those leaps back and forth in the narrative structure that you mentioned, because we see it very much in what we were discussing during the first meeting on the Soviet cinema as well. And and the speaker, actually, Igor, he was saying that sometimes you do not understand anymore if the director got bored mid-film, if the film didn't go as planned budget-wise. Why are those, why you find in those films from the 70s precisely both narrative leaps and just some industrial, like clearly like weird industrial shifts, or just you see that it's maybe not a well thought project, for example, sometimes, or it's a project that has been recut. But then again, you find it in the Western cinema as well, I think, at the time. So would you have an opinion on those anecdotes, on those anecdotal cases of just this weirdness of the long 70s?
Yes, I think that's very true about the way that a film, I think, would end up, rather different from how it was conceived. And I think by the time that it had gone through the process of script approval, where you would have various people assessing and reading it, making recommendations, pulling it in different directions, requesting, sort of certain sort of ideological additions and so on, I think you would end up with a product that was perhaps more hybrid even than it was intended to be. And I mean, it's interesting because hybridity is part of the raison d'etre of the crazy comedy, and yet I think there is a kind of hybridity that's perhaps also inadvertent. And I have not been able to sort of pursue as much of the sort of production history as I would have wanted for this film, but I do know that this is according to a thesis that was written about Czechoslovak sci-fi cinema in the 70s. There is interesting information that the reference to there is a reference at the beginning on the radio to the state socialist countries at a peace conference, and I believe that is not in the. I think it's not in the script. I think even not in the technical script of the film. So this suggests that this was added somewhere along the line, and that even that little sort of bit of detail, I mean, suggests that films would be manipulated and they would be tampered with in this way. So, these things would just get imposed onto the material somewhere along the line. And yes, it's very possible that things were added, things were changed, that were not really the intentions of the authors.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any questions? Yes, go ahead. We have a question in the audience. I have two.
Hello. Thank
Hi.
you so much for this.
Thank you.
I would actually like to tie in with the discussion that has been unfolding, because I think that first point, yes, I think Miloš Mazurek, in my opinion, is his signature is quite visible here, and this will also play a role for my question. And second, the attention that is dedicated to the details in terms of the accessories, the staging, and so on, is also to a big extent, I would say, accorded to the narrative, although it might look like it's fractious, or there are all these disruptions. In the end, for the plot to work, for these layers of history that are disjunct and dysfunctional to come together again, you have to really think it through quite a lot. So this brings me to my question. You're speaking of sabotage, and I was always wondering when looking at these films, and actually I came to them through, there's a renewed interest in, of course, alternate history and counterfactual aesthetics these days. So it's interesting to go back from that angle to these films, because then they look quite differently than the usual, they were just these crazy comedies, accommodating the ideology and so on, which is true. But as you have pointed out yourself, the ideological imprint is not the most important one. So the question would be, isn't it more on the narrative or even narratological level that we see a sort of sabotage happening? So we have, an alternate history that is being told. How could it have gone otherwise? And of course, at first sight, it seems that the history is supposed to be changed according to the leading ideology, but then that always fails in the course of the films. It never goes as intended. It's not just this film, it's also the Einstein film and others, where it doesn't go as intended. So, so isn't it then these, the very enabling of thinking a different course of history that eludes the grasp of the regime, that is, of course, transposed into different times, but with a little bit of transference can be applied to, what would have happened if Prague Spring was not crushed, for instance. So isn't it maybe on that narratological level that we can see a sort of subversion or sabotage happening?
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think that's a really great point. I think that, yes, there is something in that manipulation of time and that kind of cutting against the idea of, a sort of slightly teleological kind of viewpoint of time and of progress that I think, as you say, implicitly, it does start to present these other possibilities. And I think that was, oddly enough, that one British reviewer of the film on the IMDb, I think, kind of caught on to that. And I mean, I would love to be able to kind of like interview more people who saw this film at the time in Britain, because my feeling, I mean, as a British, viewer myself, that I think we do, when we see films from, I guess, what was then still, sort of communist Czechoslovakia, we tend to be quite conscious that we're watching a film from, a country that, imposes certain ideological requirements. And I think we tend to reject anything that feels, sort of ideologically on message. So my hunch, my suspicion is that people did feel that there was something audacious, that there was something slightly kind of subversive in the film. And I think that, as you said, that kind of puts the finger on it, that there is this, at this narrative level, in terms of this questioning of time, there is this, there is this rather unwelcome, for the regime, unwelcome opening up of other possibilities. Yes, as you say, what would have happened? How could things have happened differently if things had not, proceeded in the way that they did? And yes, I think yes, the sabotage is very much in that narrative form as well, I think.
Thank you.
Can I just add very quickly, because I mentioned Mazurek. I think he is quite apt to do this, and he did it on other levels earlier on. The first poster you had on was Who Wants to Kill Jesse, where he worked with Worlicek as well. But of course, this was 66, so a completely different atmosphere. And there, the critique is directly towards ideology, with technology being used to change and manipulate people's dreams. So it kind of shows that the impetus is there, and now it's just happening with different means that are conforming on one side, but then subvert this conformism on the other.
Yes, that's very true. I mean, I recently read Worlicek's memoir, and yes, I was quite happy to discover that he was very conscious of that. It wasn't a reading of the film that was imposed onto it, by viewers. And yeah, he in fact recalls a discussion with the actress who plays the scientist, the wife in the film, and she said to Worlicek, she said, basically, I am playing the party, aren't I? And yes, it was very pleasing to discover that they were very much aware of that. And as you say, that shows that, yes, there was that desire to challenge things. And of course, that was a little bit easier to do in the mid to late 60s, but yes, possibly it's still there after as well.
Thank you. We have another question. Yes.
Because I also wanted to speak about Mazurek, because he collaborated with comics author Kaya Sodek at the end of the 60s, beginning of 70s, and it was interesting for me because this work was banned for this comics Muriel until it was completely forbidden, and after they wrote the beginning of the second volume. I think it's Muriel and the
Orange Death.
Yes, exactly. But it was just the beginning. But this was a highly political work. So I think it's a really interesting personality. But this is not my question. My question is not very linked to what you presented today. But I would like to take the advantage that you're also specialist of the new wave here. Because I'm interested, so back in the 60s, I'm interested in the contact between the new wave and those crazy comedies. I mean, for example, it's not a comedy, of course, but we can think of the collaboration of Juracek on the Ikarie film for the script. So this, but more also the aesthetic that we can find in this time, for example, the use of colors in Lipsky movies, but we can think that Chytilova somehow also used the same filter for the scenes. So I would like just to know your opinion on this, because usually it's presented as totally different works. Like we have entertaining on one side, and the other side is horror films, new wave. but there are also genre films. So I would like to have your opinion on this contact point, or if there is none.
No, I absolutely agree with that. Yes, I'm very sympathetic to that idea of, yes, I think breaking down this barrier that it's often sort of established. I mean, I guess, you know, in other cinemas as well, between, yes, genre cinema or popular cinema on the one hand, and then art cinema on the other. And I think the more that we investigate that boundary, the kind of more porous and complicated it becomes, really. And I think, you know, in Czechoslovakia, I guess because of what happened in the 70s, that kind of rigid line was reinforced in a way because of the fact that, you know, the makers of the crazy comedies were officially favored, whereas the new wave filmmakers had to leave, or they had to make different kinds of films. And I think that tended to cement this idea that they were different kinds of cinema. And yeah, I absolutely agree that, you know, I think in many ways there is a lot in common between them. And I think when we look at certainly I think the films of the 60s, the crazy comedies of the 60s, I think where the filmmakers were maybe a bit freer to experiment visually, I think we see a lot of parallels. I mean, I think, as you say, when you look at Lemonade Joe, for example, I mean, it's doing a lot of the things with filters and with color and with sort of cinematic trickery that a film like Daisies or The Fruit of Paradise is doing. And I mean, one really fascinating example for me is the film Happy End by Oldřich Lipský, which he made around 1967. And I believe he made, this was also Matt Thorek again, and this was made, I think, it was made within the same production group that also made Juráček and Chytilová's films. And there's an interesting statement by Lipský about the film to kind of present it in the press. And he said that this is an experiment. And he was very adamant to say that this is not a new wave style experiment, but nonetheless, it is an experiment. And I would say that, you know, for me, there are a lot of connections in that film, especially with the new wave. I mean, you only have to think about the representation of eating, for example, which is something that, again, I think there's another critic who has mentioned this. I think Martin Schreier, I think, has looked at that there is a sort of a big parallel between the eating scenes in Daisies and the eating scenes in Happy End. And of course, it's playing with narrative structure. It's playing with time. It's very visually stylized. And even though Krumbaková, I think, did not work on that film, but I know that she worked on Man from Outer Space by Oldřich Lipský, which in a way is, I think we could almost say, is perhaps the first crazy comedy. I mean, it's the first example of that. And so I think her sensibility, you know, is again another thing that links the visual qualities. So yeah, I completely agree. I think there are a lot of connections.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, I will keep on the same topic a little, because maybe on a more general level, what you're saying is two very important points, I think, are first, that there would be a lot of non-new wave film experiment that would be going on in the socialist cinema in the 60s and the late 50s, even sometimes in the 70s, early 70s. And I think some researchers, scholars, especially, I'm afraid, Western scholars, tend to think the new wave as this like sweeping literal wave that would overtake the whole production of the Barrandov studio, of the Koleba atelier in Bratislava and in Prague. And no, actually, it is very interesting precisely to see where this experimentation lands in film, in comedies like The Man from the First Century, which I absolutely love. It's like the pinnacle of this space age fascination. But then again, it marries very well the genre, popular literature, even, like the character is very shaky, and he's in the midst of this whole space exploration. And all, and he's like, is worried about his comfort and stuff. But at the same time, or the same you can tell about children's cinema, because Would you say that there is a new wave in children's films like Máte doma lva? Do you have a lion at home, for example, which is very it's very close to films like Daisies in many ways. It uses collage. It uses. I'm not sure if it's a Jaroslav Kuchera film too, but it's clearly very close. And still, it is a children's film that nobody, to my knowledge, has ever called a new wave film, although it's a 1963 or 5 film. I don't remember correctly. Yes, so that first, but then my second point I wanted to make is the notion of popular culture and of popular cinema is very interesting, I believe, in socialist, state socialist countries of the era, but not in the way we would expect, because there is this strange permanent push-pull between the state-imposed, proletarian, popular, not even like mass culture and stuff. There is an opposition to the Western style pop culture and the fascination with the Western style pop culture. There is an opposition with towards the Western style Marxist approaches to mass culture and mass production. And then there is in Czechoslovakia, like in the Czech lands especially, you have this just centuries long tradition of popular entertainment, of just folklore, even whatever the term may mean, and like the pocket novel, the serial novel, for example, from the early 20th century. So, yeah, what's your approach to the popular culture overall, to the popular cinema overall? How do you deal with the concept? How do you use concept in your research in general, applied to Czechoslovak or Polish cinema, for example?
Yes, I mean, I think it's very interesting, to refer to, yes, there are those older forms of popular culture, aren't there? I guess in Czechoslovakia or in the Czech lands, like the pocket novel, the Rodo Caps, and I feel that there are, yes, I guess there are maybe alternative concepts of popular culture, but I feel that in Czechoslovakia, I feel that there was, I think, a certain realm where that could exist, I think. So, I mean, if you think of the fact that, I mean, Jerzy Trnka is making films in the 50s, the 40s and 50s, I mean, at the height of, the Stalinist system. And of course, he's drawing on folklore. And I mean, I guess he represents that, I guess we might call purer type of Czech folk or popular culture. I feel that they are able to coexist. I mean, I think that what tended to be less welcome, I guess, was the more recent, more Western style of popular culture. So I believe, for example, that the James Bond films were not shown really. They were not really acceptable, I think, in the 60s and 70s. And so I guess when Badechka is making Adela ještě nevečeřela, Adela has not eaten dinner yet, in the 70s, I mean, he's parodying something that I guess people had only had a very dim awareness of, based on, older nostalgic forms of that kind of thriller detective material. So yes, I guess that there was a space in which maybe a more traditional Czech or even, I guess, Western popular culture could exist. But yes, there was a certain reserve towards, yes, what was considered as like popular, or I think the word is like poklesla. Poklesla, is that the correct term, I believe, in Czech? What was considered as, I guess we might translate as trashy kind of Western culture. I think this was something that was held at a bit of a remove. And I guess this is where the crazy comedy comes in, because of course, movies could represent that. They could refer, for example, to comics. Of course, comics were seen as very much an American or a Western thing, but they could do so with the alibi that they were parodying it and that they were critiquing it. So I guess that was the way to make that kind of, supposedly Western or American style of popular culture acceptable. So I guess it was, even that was possible, but with this framing, I guess.
Yes, thank you. This is very interesting, actually, that you mentioned the Adela hasn't had supper yet, and the vague idea that the spectators, the audience, would have of the references, the cultural motifs in it. It is the same with to an extent with the cowboy films and Red Indian films. Because you have the notion of like the Red Indians of Vietrov and films that are centered on the idea of like plain cowboys and Indians, and there is a bunch of plain in Pantao. And of course, Karl May is the local phenomenon and the regional phenomenon that has heavily influenced the pop culture. But also this second-hand, third-hand even acquaintance with the pop culture tropes. It's very interesting indeed, and especially in the era that is ostensibly fighting against all things Western and all things foreign and bourgeois, and yet those. But then, for me, I wonder if those attempts to introduce, speaking of sabotage again. To introduce or to reintroduce such tropes or such just themes as, I don't know, cowboys or a superhero agent, like a police agent. Wouldn't they be also an attempt to reconnect with your own First Republic past, for example, to just to put it right in the middle of this socialist film, of this normalization film, actually? It's almost like an identity question, actually. So
yes, I guess the political or the ideological concerns always had to be balanced with that concern with popularity and with distribution. And so I think that, I guess there was an awareness that it was, popular films and it was, comedy films with genre elements, that these were the films that both would be, popular with local audiences and would also be distributable abroad. So I guess sometimes I'm wondering how much there was just a compromise and how much there was an acknowledgement that this is the sort of material that we can sell internationally. And but yes, as you say, often, I mean, there is that risk, isn't there, that you are referring back to the pre-communist past. I mean, very much with the case of films like Lemonade Joe, which, I mean, of course is, literally referencing American Westerns, but you can say there is also kind of there is I guess for maybe older viewers watching that in the 60s, there would have been a callback perhaps to the the tramping and to that culture of outdoor activities in the 1930s, which was very much, I think, a symbol of freedom in that time. And yeah, I guess that was the risk that was there.
Well, do we have any questions? Otherwise, I will just go on for another 8 minutes that we have left with my obscure remarks. Go ahead.
It's maybe more a remark, since you were also mentioning Saudek and Muriel, and there was a question about pop culture. So I think that there is a very interesting interlocking there in the late 1960s between the comic strip and the film. And actually, this is my thesis. I'm about to publish an article on this. I think that as they knew that the Muriel series will not be published, the different parts of it were smuggled into movies. So I would read even Who Wants to Kill Jesse as a precursor to the Muriel project. And then, and this we can really identify if you look at this other film, Four Murders Are Enough, Darling, also with Mazurek and Vorlicek. There, literally, it's a different plot, it's a different story, but the different pages from Muriel and the Orange Death are smuggled in, and you can identify them. Of course, then the question remains, this is something only the people involved in this circle could really recognize, because nobody had ever seen the pages published. And the same for Who Wants to Kill Jesse, where there's an absolute, at least to my knowledge, novelty in cinema history that the bubbles, the speech bubbles, are put in action in a film, which has never happened before to my knowledge. But again, these references where I wonder to what degree they were understandable or graspable for a general public who went to see the film.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because before you answer, yes, my spontaneous reaction would be just fascination at this era, like pre-internet era, where today we kind of expect that anybody has seen everything basically. Yeah, but then the question of circulation is very important indeed.
Yes, I mean, one of the fascinating things about Who Wants to Kill Jesse is the figure of the Superman character, isn't it? Because, I mean, people have suggested that, that the fact that the Superman is a bad guy in the movie, that was reflective of the fact that maybe the makers were not aware enough of Western culture. I don't really agree. I think they knew, and it was just a playful joke. But yeah, one wonders how much that would have registered as a joke to the audience. And yes, I think the whole idea of parodying something of which the audiences might not be aware is very interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, we assume that to enjoy a parody you have to know the original, and I think some of these films tend to suggest that maybe it was not always necessary. And yeah, I really like that idea that they were kind of, in the case of Kaya Saudek, that he was actually smuggling in pages of his work into these movies, because that turns this from a parody into actually a covert, exposure of that medium. So yeah, that's a really interesting turnaround, I guess. And
thank you. So the last call, we have the last 4 minutes. Go ahead.
Just about this, because I'm also interested, and I also wrote a paper about Saudek's works. And I think that Jesse is also a less political character than Muriel in some aspects. But it's true that I think they had knowledge of Western culture in the 60s, especially. For example, the Disney comics were published in some literature for children, and I found, I mean, probably you know the first page of the Muriel in the news in the youth magazine, where Saudek refers to Western culture as influence. So I think maybe it's less, it was better known that what we have this impression that Czechoslovakia was completely cut from the rest of the world. But I think in the 60s especially, there were also this Wolicek in his memoir, because you mentioned it. He said that he collected the comics from from Germany after the Second World War, when the US military left. They threw away a lot of comics in the bins. So he collected them and kept them, and he had this fascination for the characters of these comics. And also, I think we can imagine that these personalities who had the privilege in the society, like Mazurek, somehow they can have access to Western works. And one of the models of Muriel is also the French character Barbarella. And for sure, I think the Czechoslovak population, they didn't know this character, but he acted as a transmitter of this culture. So I totally agree with Anastasia's statement on this, that there is a circulation.
Well, people on Zoom, maybe a question, a remark? Okay.
I have a question. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you for
Hi,
the
Emily.
presentation.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Yeah. I noticed, you had the slide showing all the posters of various crazy comedies. And I noticed, aside from How to Drown Dr. Mrachek, they were all sci-fi. And, there's a few folklore, fairy tale, crazy comedies. There's a Carrier XP1 is kind of a straight sci-fi, but it seems like there's just so many sci-fi comedies. So I was just curious if you had any thoughts on, why that is, what was the general attitude towards science and sci-fi in Czechoslovakia at the time, that, is it that they didn't hold it in high regard, so they could make all these farces about it? I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that's very true, that I think certainly as the 60s gives way to the 70s, that science fiction does tend to become the kind of predominant form, really. I mean, in the 60s, you have a few other types of genre. You have Western in Lemonade Joe, for example. You have comics, although I guess Who Wants to Kill Jesse is still a sci-fi film as well. And there is an attempt to kind of slightly, I guess, kind of gothic horror in Phantom from Morrisville. But yeah, sci-fi does become the predominant form. I am not exactly sure why that does become so dominant. I would suggest perhaps partly because I think other genres were, even less acceptable perhaps than sci-fi. I mean, I know that horror, for example, was looked down upon and was more critically regarded, say, than sci-fi. And so perhaps, it was just that it was more acceptable than other types of genre material. I mean, maybe also the fact that somebody like Polák, I mean, of course, had made Icarus XB1, and he just wanted to really continue to make sci-fi, and he had to use this kind of comic form to do that. But yes, it is very true that I think sci-fi does become the predominant form. And yeah, I can't really give a straightforward answer. I think that it was really just perhaps in the absence of, other more acceptable, or, maybe because other genres were less acceptable. But yes, it is a strange, yeah, there is a strange kind of preponderance of sci-fi material in these movies. I mean, perhaps it also just gave the filmmakers space to play, space to imagine.
Thank you so much for joining us and for speaking and for sharing your views and answering the questions.